This is a Geek Leader podcast, and I'm your host, John Rauda. This show is all about helping us grow as leaders, become better technologists, and improve our lives both at work and at home. I hope you enjoy the show and learn a lot. Welcome to episode 187 of Geek Leader Podcast. I'm your host, John Rauda, and today's sponsor is Private Internet Access. You can find out more about Private Internet Access by going to geekleader.com/VPN. So what do I talk about Private Internet Access? Well, Private Internet Access has a service of global VPNs that allow you to connect many different devices to their VPN, which will mask where you're coming from on the internet. So why do you say you want to do that? I'm not a criminal. I don't want to do that. But it adds a layer of protection. So if you are traveling and you want to connect somewhere, you're at the mercy of the Wi-Fi of wherever you're located. If you're going to connect, maybe you're on vacation or you're traveling for holidays, you're at a family's house, you can protect where you're coming from by using Private Internet Access. You can also test out the internet from different places. So many of us have jobs where we're building websites, we're developing software, or we want to test out bandwidth of what it's like to connect from, let's say, California or from the UK or from Brazil. You can do all that with Private Internet Access, and you can get a discount today by going to geekleader.com/VPN. All right, Geek Leaders, today on the show, I've got Brett Putter. He is an expert in company culture development, and he's also the CEO and founder of CultureGene, which is a culture leadership software and services platform. He's also the author of two great books, Culture, Decks Decoded, and his latest book, Own Your Own Culture, How to Define, Embed, and Manage Your Company's Culture. Brett, welcome to the show.
John, great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no problem. If you don't mind telling the audience just a little bit about how you got to where you are today and kind of how you got started with your career and how that has developed into you founding your company, CultureGene.
Sure, thanks very much. I will do. So I was the managing partner of an executive search firm based in London for 16 years, typically working with high growth, early stage emerging technology companies. And about 5 years ago now, I worked with three companies, almost one after the other, where the CEO had a very clear understanding of their culture. And so I was asked to find candidates that matched had the necessary skills and expertise and experience. But they also asked me to find candidates that matched the values of the company. And this was a much harder search to do. It took me much longer. We weren't used to doing this kind of search. But we got there eventually. And where I really realized where the sort of penny dropped for me was when the interviews started happening, because the interviews, you could just tell when the candidates' values matched the companies and the leaders. And there was one situation where it was almost as if these two people had been dancing tango for 10 years. They were sort of almost completing one another's sentences. And this is where I started to I realized, hold on, there's something missing here. So I thought culture seems to be missing when it comes to startups. And actually later on with all three of those companies, the candidates we placed made such an impact on the business that I decided, no, I've got to start really researching culture and understanding company culture. And that's really how I got where I got to today, because what I started doing is I started working with the leaders of companies if they hadn't done any work on their values and their mission and their vision, I just asked them as part of the interview process about a new job role. I'd say, what's your values? Let's talk about that. And that's where really I started to develop this methodology that I've developed for CultureGene. I also interviewed over 50 leaders of high growth companies to really understand how they define, embed, and manage their culture on a day-to-day basis. And those are the foundations of Own Your Culture, which is as you mentioned, my most recent book.
Awesome. So when it comes to defining cultures, let's say you're a middle manager and you got hired at a company that's small to medium size, or maybe even medium to large size company, and there is no defined culture that's given to you. You're new in the role. How do you figure out what that culture is if that company hasn't gone about, from the top down defining that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So a company always has a culture. And your culture essentially starts from day one, when 2 or 3 co-founders get in a room and come up with this idea, and then start to hire or develop the idea, and then raise some money or do some sales and then hire people. But essentially, your culture is this subconscious, invisible, intangible thing that develops over time through learning. So if you, as a middle manager, go and join a company, small, medium to large size company, and they haven't done any work on their culture, they still have a culture. And so essentially what I recommend, and this is what I take my clients through, is I recommend trying to understand what the current culture is. And often there's a difference between the current culture, in other words, what the people really experience, and the aspirational culture, which is what the leadership often think their culture is, or hope it is, but it often isn't. And so, you could go around asking people, what's important to you? What are the key words for you? Why do you work here? What are the elements of this business that you really enjoy? And there's different ways of doing this, but essentially it's really important to understand the difference between what the culture really is and what the aspirational culture is. And then to think about, okay, how do we get towards the aspirational culture? But it's invariably, I don't recommend that you do it from the top down. I don't think that leaders should say, this is the culture, because that doesn't involve your team are not engaged in defining the culture. So I recommend you work with a team. You involve 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 people in talking about it and whiteboarding it and sticky notes. You do this all digitally now, but really it's a process to understand what the culture really is.
So how would you define culture? Like if I just had to throw, maybe I'm a new manager, new leader, and I've heard people talk about culture, but I really don't know what it is.
Yeah, that's another good question. So culture, the way I like to define culture is the way we do things around here.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is deliberately broad and all encompassing, because really culture happens below the surface, and it's as I mentioned, it's learned over time. And it's this random combination of good and bad behaviors, habits, rituals, routines, communication styles, the processes, the structures, the procedures we develop. And it's really the way we do things around here. And if you think about culture, it changes and can change quite quickly depending on the circumstances your business is in. If you're a high growth company, your culture will change from 20 people and working together, and then all of a sudden you've doubled or tripled in size, you're 60, 70 people. The way you worked when you were 20 is completely different to the way you work. There's more structure, there's more leadership, more process, and that means your culture has changed. So really, if you think about the way we work around here and then start to pick out the key bits of what you expect and don't expect from your people and your team and your leaders, then you can start to really understand what it is and why it's important to you.
Mm. Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think, I like to think of culture as being kind of like that thing that you all know, but just hard to say.
Exactly. It's another way of describing it is the thing you do when nobody's looking, when the leader's not around, you just get on with it.
Yeah, it's the activities that aren't documented.
Yeah, exactly. Although that's what it was. Unfortunately, now in this new world, we have to document them. But we can cover remote or hybrid work at a later stage if you like. But yeah, this is this is and it's unfortunately, and one of the hardest parts about this is actually starting to document these things, because otherwise your new joiners or the people who change teams are not going to know what your culture is, because they can't learn through osmosis anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. So how have you seen, right now we're in the middle of this huge pandemic, which has shaken up pretty much everything, now people are working more remote than they were in the past. And how have you seen culture impacted by this? Because, sometimes it's hard to get the feel of what the culture is when all day it's just over Zoom.
Yeah. And I was very fortunate. I actually, because I built some software to replicate my process. I was approached about 18 months ago by two remote companies to say, can I help with their culture development and defining their culture and helping them embed it and manage it. And I realized that my process, which was very much in person, wouldn't work for them, because I would have to split myself into 100 people. And so I then decided that I was going to build some software around this. And really what I've noticed is the remote companies focused down on 9 real best practices because they didn't have the luxuries that came with an office. They had to be deliberate about their culture and defining the way they do things around here from the beginning. And so unknowingly, most office-based leaders relied on their office and osmosis to develop and maintain their culture. And now that we're all remote, all of that is changing, and will continue to change. So what I'm actually seeing is that every previously office-based culture is degrading. Some that worked on their culture beforehand slower than others, but essentially people are losing that feel of community, that feel of social connection. There's information loss, information leak. There is the ability to read somebody's body language, that informal communication that happened. What we had in December 2019 has completely changed to what we have now and what we will have going forward. So I'm seeing tremendous culture change, but the problem is I'm actually not seeing leaders adapt properly to this. I'm not seeing leaders come to terms with this yet.
So what are some steps that maybe, me as a, leader of a department or a team can do to come to grips with this, to make our necessary adjustments to keep things in line and to build that culture that's necessary when now our team, we went from having, daily stand-ups or one-on-ones with everybody in person, and now it's all remote. How do you go about doing that?
Yeah. So the first thing I work on with my clients is well-being. And this is actually morale, mental health, and burnout issues are about to be a really, really big problem for most companies. And you're starting to see maybe one person's mentioning it, maybe 2 people in the company are mentioning it, but that means it's rife everywhere else. And so really building that well-being element and understanding how people are operating under this anxiety and stress is really, really critical. Something else that I encourage people to do is focus on communication. Remote companies do a lot of their communication asynchronously, and we are used to talking synchronously, where we need to be present, we need to be available. And that's another area where people, I'm experiencing, I do a lot of Zoom calls, and then I end up doing work at night, and I'm doing much longer hours. I can't seem to find that balance. Remote companies work very hard on process. And so taking the processes that happen naturally and then actually documenting them is critical. And documentation is critical. So I'd start working on these elements. The first of all, well-being and the social connection, making sure that people are connecting, people are communicating, people are remembering what it is about one another that is so cool about this company. And then, being deliberate about communication, about process, about the documentation side of it. And those are some of the things that I would start thinking about and start looking at how to improve in my company.
Do you think this pandemic is going to kind of uncover some of the hidden cultures that may have been underneath there? Because you think about, like, I'm in tech, and a lot of people in tech, you have this facade of like having a big campus, having pool tables and bowling alleys or whatever on site, and dining cafes, and now all that's kind of useless because people are remote, so they're not using those amenities, and that was kind of what they used to help define their fun culture. What are they going to have to do now to kind of uncover that maybe that was just surface level?
Yeah, this is a big challenge for a lot of companies right now because they don't have those crutches or those additional luxuries. I'm seeing companies do cool stuff. So one of my clients, they do an 8:45 a.m. walk where everybody goes on, uses their mobile phones, plugs in their headsets, and the whole company goes for a walk for 15 minutes. And it's random, so people will chat about things. Somebody will say, "Wow, check this! Take a photograph of a bird or something." It's a really interesting way of bringing people together before the day starts. Other companies are doing, morning check-ins that are not work-related. They're doing lunch and learn webinars. They're doing Friday drinks and cocktail parties. The whole thing about this is building that social connection. It's easy to start to do, but very hard to do well. over time, because what's happening with most companies I'm talking to is their social connection, their digital attempts to humanize this COVID experience are now falling flat. And I think the reason because of that is because most people are hoping they're going to go back to the way it was.
Yeah.
And that's just not going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
There may be some hybrid work, but it's going to be a very rare situation where you as a leader can force everybody back into the office where they don't have to be back into the office.
Right.
So that means that it's like actually moving from living on Earth to living on the moon. Gravity's changed, what we wear has changed, how we breathe has changed, what we breathe. It's that fundamentally different. And I recommend to my clients that they should allow their people to grieve for the work that was. Say goodbye. Maybe you can have a bit of it from time to time in 6 months' time or a year's time, but say goodbye to it. And now let's, as a company, really focus on working on this. It's not the leadership's responsibility or just HR's responsibility. It's all of our responsibility to build these connections, to bring it to we can't replicate all sitting down in the campus and having dinner, but we can do similar things that if we don't compare, because that's never going to happen again or won't happen as it did, then we'll be okay with it.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point too. I definitely don't think things will ever go back to the way they were. There's a new normal now. We're on a new timeline, if you will. Things are going to be different, and part of that is because we've seen significant advances on how people work remotely. There were a big group of individuals and industries even that said, "Oh, we'll never be remote. We're always going to be in the office type folks." And then when they were forced to do it, like the education, we take that as an example. I've been an adjunct professor for 15 years now, and the classes that I've taught have been in person, for the most part. And at this university, it's just always been an in-person. You came on campus, you moved on campus, you went through school. And then when COVID hit, they forced us all to be remote. And now we've completed, a semester and a half of being remote. And a lot of, students aren't ever going to come back to campus. It's now we're forced to do that. So the mindset of the college and the university has changed to where we're going to be remote now, figured out. We're going to have to go that route. And I think that's the new normal in lots of different places and lots of industries. And I like the fact that you're talking about the fact that, leaders have to, understand that we're not going to be back the way it was before, at least not anytime soon.
Absolutely not. And I think allowing your people to understand that as a concept is really critical. Because then we can say, okay, let's all get consensus on this. Let's now all work together to make this better in 2021. 2020 was our year of survive in most cases. Let's just get through it. But 2021 has got to be a year of, okay, let's get ahead of this now. Let's get our culture right. Let's adapt to hybrid work. Hybrid and remote work, they sound different, but they're almost the same. And actually, it's harder to run a hybrid environment than it is to run a remote environment. As a leader, you have to realize this. Running a hybrid work environment where some people are in the office and some people are working from home is tougher because you end up with an us and them situation. You end up in a situation where the remote people don't feel like they get the same work experience, the same cultural experience. They feel disconnected and they're not included in the decision making. They also have to advocate more for themselves in their work, and they feel like they're not included in the same way that the people in the office are from a promotion point of view.
Right.
This is going to end up with them feeling like second-class citizens. And if I was a second-class citizen in a company, I would leave to become a first-class citizen in a company that gets the way I want to work. So this is a really big issue for companies now.
Yeah, and I've seen that too, because it's not just, you mentioned the big things like promotions and things like that, but it's also the little things, like someone will bring donuts in for the team that are there. Well, if you're at a 50-50 capacity workspace and half the people are remote, one half is left out, right? And a lot of times conversations, they'll go from Slack to in person and back to Slack, and the person that's remote only gets half that conversation. And now, now they're confused. And not only that, when you're remote, sometimes you feel like you have to work harder to justify that you're actually working, because people don't see you working, and it's one of those things where you find that the person remote is actually, instead of putting in the 40 hours a week, like that may be standard for your company, they're putting in the 50, because they want to make sure that it's seen that they're actually working harder, but they're only getting recognized for maybe putting in 30 because they're not there.
Yeah. And there's actually been some research done on this, and actually remote employees work a day more.
Wow.
Literally a day more.
Yeah, but they get paid the same. Wow. So, looking at the fact that hybrid, you mentioned hybrid as being even more difficult. How can someone kind of keep the playing field fair when you have, half your employees on site and half remote? Like, what are some things that we can be intentional about as a leader to make sure that things are fair?
Yeah. So I think as a leader, I would ask myself the following questions. How do I create a fulfilling, inclusive, and equitable experience for everybody? What do I need to do that? And what do I need to do to create a situation where there are no advantages or disadvantages to working in an office or remotely? And so really, there are only 5 things that you can do here. The first one is to treat remote working as the default way of working. So to be remote first. The second one is to build remote first best practices into the DNA of the company. The third one is to ensure that remote employees feel as part of the team as those in the office. This isn't always possible, but if you ensure that if you're gonna bring everybody donuts, make sure that that the remote team gets something. Doesn't maybe have to be donuts, but they have to get something. Everybody must experience the culture in the same way so that there are no second-class citizens. And the last thing, and this is what leaders are not that comfortable about when I tell them, is leaders must work mostly or all remote. Because if they're in the office, everybody else will gravitate around them, and then you will build that second-class citizen situation.
Yep. I definitely can see that, because if you have access to the boss that someone else doesn't, you're going to talk to the boss more and build that relationship stronger than the person that's remote.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's a tough one, because a lot of times leaders feel like they have to be there. They feel like they, to be in charge, that, you're supposed to be visible. So you have to be there.
Yeah, I think this current situation is demonstrating to them that they don't. Although not every leader is doing this very well. One of my clients, the CEO, one of their really, really impressive leaders in the office, actually is a bit of a micromanager. And actually, micromanagement in this environment is really tough, both for the manager and for the people they're managing, because as you said earlier, they feel like they need to compensate and work harder to show the micromanager that they're working. And actually, where this has come to a head is two of their key developers are about to leave because of this, and they burnt out. They've had enough. It's not working because the micromanager has over-indexed on how you're doing, what are you doing, and not letting these developers who previously he would not be as bad, but they now can't deal with him.
Yeah, so, I've seen that myself. Like when you're managing people and you can't see what they're doing, you feel like you have to ask, and that makes you're just getting on their nerves, plus, their perspective, because if you were talking to them face to face, you would have a smile on your face. They would understand where you're coming from. But if you're just sending a message, it depends on the mood that person's in when they receive that Slack or whatever to dictate how they're perceiving your attitude. You may be kidding around and joking and having a good time, and they think you're like hassling them, you're coming down on them. You want to see exactly what's going on. It's a very difficult situation.
Yeah, it's actually, you're spot on, but it's actually not about the hours worked. It's not about what's being done. It's about the outcomes of what you've agreed. And that's really the key element here. Is what remote leaders do very well is they give their people more structure, and they trust the team to manage their time, the days, and responsibilities around the agreed outcome. So the best leaders are agreeing an outcome and saying, can you do this? Yes, you can. When can you do it? By then? Okay, if you've got a problem, come and talk to me, but get on with it.
Yeah.
Go and do it.
Yeah. I definitely can see that being the a big challenge. Just perceptions of communications being different. One of the things that I've started to do a lot more frequently with my team that when we're remote is to call more. Do more audio because although I'm not getting the body language, I'm at least getting the vocal tonality in the communication that's going on, and not just the text. Because sometimes with the text, I may come across harsh. I may come across as picking things apart when I'm asking questions. When in reality, I'm just curious. I have a more curious nature, and I want to just talk. And so I found that a lot of times when I feel like I'm going to type a lot, I'm just going to stop and I'm going to call them. Do an audio chat or a video chat or something like that, to where we have more of that in-person type feel.
Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of that. One of the challenges with that is that you that requires somebody to be present and available,
Correct.
and the need to be present and available in a remote environment where you may have somebody delivering something. You may have to take the dog for a walk. You may have to look after your sick grandparent. You may have to go and pick up the kids. You may have to do these various things. That presence and availability adds an extremely high pressure onto the team. So it's I'm sure you're doing this, but it's important to balance it out, because you were saying there, I'm writing a lot, and actually a lot. The remote companies move from a speak first mentality to a write first mentality, because that write first mentality allows your team to respond asynchronously to that communication. They don't have to respond immediately. And I think this is getting that balance right, which I'm sure you're working on, between that synchronous communication when needed and then the writing when it's not needed. I think that's one of the key elements to being a great leader.
Yeah, I think one part of that is to also communicate that it's okay not to respond right away. I know that was one of the challenges when I first took the role that I'm at now. The guy that was previously in charge of this department would expect you to reply to his messages or things right away, and if you didn't, he was questioning what you were doing. Whereas I had the mindset that you don't have to reply right away. I don't even me personally, I don't keep Outlook open all the time. So if I get an email, it may be twice a day that I check it. So I'm not going to reply right away, and that's okay. And I think part of it's setting those cultural norms within your teams of what is okay and what's not okay, and what the expectations are.
Absolutely. People use email as a semi-synchronous or even a synchronous tool, and that's not really what it should be for.
Yeah.
And so it's a really great example of, if you keep your email off, it's definitely going to be an asynchronous communication, because you will respond when it's back on.
Yeah, exactly. So what are some things that, you mentioned before, that kind of we have a lack of culture that's almost like a pandemic in and of itself within companies. What are you seeing with this lack of cultural development, not culture, but culture development, that companies aren't being intentional about building this culture that they have, whether they are building it or not? What should they be doing to kind of develop the culture within a company?
Yeah, I think often the problem is not that the leadership don't want to develop a culture. It's just because they don't know how. And so you do have a small percentage of leaders that just don't care. They're going to run it their way, and it's my way or the highway, too bad. And so, but the majority of leaders want to do something about it. They really don't know what to do. So they define their values and their mission and their vision, stick them up on the wall, and maybe in the good old days print some mouse mats and get it printed on the coffee cups. But that's it. Nothing changed. So what we do with our clients is we define the mission and the vision, and then we define the values of the company. And we use a broader team from the company to get involved in this process. And once we've defined the values, we then go to the next step. And this is the step that most companies get wrong. The problem with values is they're open to interpretation. Human beings interpret for themselves first, and then for the company or whoever else second. So I will interpret this word, teamwork or honesty or candidness or whatever the value is. I'll interpret it my way first. And the best companies actually define what I call the expected behaviors. So this value is teamwork. The expected behavior is we behave to ensure that the team always comes first.
Mm-hmm.
So if I say we ensure the team always comes first, there's no doubt about what I mean by that. We're going to look after one another. We are going to make sure we come first. Once you've got these expected behaviors against your values, you can turn those into interview questions. So the interview question example there is, when last did you take one for the team and why? Now we're evaluating this person based on their actual behavior, not what they think about something or how they feel about something. It's their actual behavior. And then we can really dig into their answers and understand the why and the what and the where and the impacts and so on. So what I do with my clients is help them define their values, the expected behaviors, and then we embed those expected behaviors into the way the leadership team look at how they lead. We look at the functions, we look at the processes of the business, and we embed these values and behaviors into every single element of the business so that it becomes like natural. It's a habit. It's what we do. We don't even have to think about it anymore. And that's really where you have to go to develop your culture in an effective way, is use the values and understand what they mean to the company, and then embed those into the leadership, the functions, and the processes of business.
Yeah, absolutely. So another thing you talk about is why it's important to have that strong culture that's kind of embedded in those processes like you're talking about during difficult times. Why is it more important to have that already built, before you hit these kind of strange, difficult times like we're hitting right now?
Yeah, so I'm seeing this now. I was really surprised when I first started interviewing companies for my book, Own Your Culture, because I would be told, go and speak to James. He's got a great culture. And I'd go and speak to James, and James and I would chat, and I'd say, okay, I've got a bunch of questions for you. And he'd say, shoot, and I'd start. And after the third question, he would invariably say to me, no, we haven't got to that level yet. We just got some values and we do good stuff, and we got an employee of the month. That's about it. And so I had to really speak to 500 companies to be able to interview on a deeper level 50, just over 50 companies. And those interviews are what's gone into my book. And if you think about this, that means 9 out of 10 companies have not defined their culture. And their culture is now degrading because that was an office-based culture. They relied on their office for osmosis, for social connection, for proximity, for that culture, the social camaraderie, the fun, the laughter. You could see when somebody was unhappy or happy. You relied on that proximity. And now we don't have that. So now we've got to adapt to that. And so the companies that worked really hard on embedding their culture pre-COVID, they're still struggling. They're still finding it hard, but they're having a much, much easier time than the companies that did nothing about their culture. And this is a perfect example of that.
Yeah, and I've seen that too, like where companies have been deliberate about, building a strong culture and communicating about what that culture is, and making steps, like you said, going from your actual culture to your perceived, what your desired culture will be, and making those actual steps, have had a better time of people adjusting, I think, to this remote environment or hybrid environment, as you're calling it, than other companies that just kind of, for better or worse terms, that they just kind of tried to wing it, Yeah,
exactly. You're spot on there. I think this is a big challenge. It's a big challenge because actually leaders are not realizing that all of these things have changed. Many things have changed. They're not realizing that they have to now adapt to that. They have to actually get ahead of this, because otherwise it's going to come back to bite them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's one of those things where you have to build that, I guess you would call it cultural capital. You have to have that capital in the bank that you can withdraw from whenever you need to in a tough situation.
Spot on. Exactly right.
So another thing that I had a question about that I kind of wanted to hit on is, you talk about a decision checklist. What is that, and how can that benefit a company?
So a decision checklist is really about how you embed your culture. So a typical example is a CEO stands up and says, customer success is really important. It's really important to us. But actually, nobody believes that CEO, because the CEO doesn't reward or recognize any customer success. The CEO doesn't measure any customer success metrics. The CEO doesn't hire good people, doesn't do any training around this. And there are essentially only 6 ways to embed culture, and I've explained 4 of them there in that CEO example. Mm-hmm. The 6 ways to embed culture and this decision sort of evaluation, decision checklist. How are you rewarding and recognizing? Are you rewarding and recognizing against your values and behaviors? What are you measuring and paying attention to? And does that reinforce your values and behaviors? What are you training and educating your people on? Does that reinforce? How are you hiring, firing, and promoting? Are you doing that against the values or not? What are you doing when it comes to learning and development? How are you behaving in this crisis situation? Because if you are Jekyll and Hyde in this crisis situation, that breaks your culture. It doesn't embed your culture. So really, this is a framework for the leadership team to look at their decisions and go, does the decision I'm taking reinforce our culture or destroy or slowly chip away, or does it degrade our culture? Because this is really critical, because behavior is what your team are watching, not the words you say only. They really want to see you, walk the talk.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's, like they say, you got to put your money where your mouth is, right? If you're going to talk about, customer satisfaction, then you've got to reward on that.
Exactly.
Well, Brett, what have I not hit about that I should have asked about that I didn't?
Well, I think we've pretty much covered it. I think the one thing that I would say to people is the sort of conversation. During the conversation, I mentioned, it's like living on the moon, and I really think this is important for people to understand, that our work life has changed fundamentally. And the sooner we get our team to really understand it and grasp it, and we get our team solving this with us, the better we will be as organizations. And I think this is the 2021 challenge, is getting your team on board so that you can move the needle for a remote or hybrid work, because that's where we're going. It's never, well, shouldn't say never, but it's unlikely to go back to what it was.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you 100%. I think that it's foolish to believe that everything's going to be back to normal once this vaccine hits. I think we've kind of let Pandora out of the box here, and we've realized that there's another world out there, another dimension of thinking when it comes to how people work, and we've got to embrace and focus on that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, Brett, man, I really appreciate having you on. How can people find out more about you and pick up a copy of your book?
Sure. So my website's www.culturegene.ai, and it's Brett at CultureGene.ai. I spend a lot of time talking to people about culture because it's my passion. I want to, I'm a student of it. So if people want to share ideas and just drop me a line, I'm happy to have a chat. I'm on LinkedIn, obviously, Brett and Pata. I'm on Twitter. And my books are both on Amazon, Culture, Decks Decoded, and Own Your Culture. I highly recommend Own Your Culture. It's a tactical book about defining, embedding, and managing culture. It's real, in the weeds, real actual experiences of startup founders and high growth company founders in the trenches. So I highly recommend it. It's the first book that's been written from a tactical perspective for startups and high growth companies. And I look forward to anybody's feedback or comments on the book.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And I'll only call that up in the show notes at geekleader.com. And Brett, thanks for coming on the show. Thanks for spending some time and talking with us about this. I really appreciate it.
John, my pleasure, and great to be on board. Really enjoyed it.
If you enjoyed that episode, please leave a rating and review in Apple Podcasts. I'd greatly appreciate that. And also, don't forget to check out merch. We have some T-shirts that I've designed that are on at geekleader.com. You can click on the merchandise section there and check that out. And also, don't forget about the books from our guests. So if you like this guest and other guests that have written books, please go ahead and check that out at geekleader.com. I would greatly appreciate it, and I'm sure they would too.